topic is the idea of the Bronze Age as a problem in global history. When I say problem, I mean an obstacle, not a question. Critical studies of the Bronze Age are increasing in frequency. In some cases, it's the Eurocentric focus in Bronze Age studies on the movements of the Indo-Europeans, or the construction of a chronology that is drawn from apparent changes in Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Sometimes that's the problem. In other cases, the attempts to impose a progressive stadial narrative upon archaeological findings are criticized. In still other cases, rooting Bronze Age ideology in the 19th century obsessions with paradigms, especially paradigms that are framed by 19th century racial thinking, sometimes that's the target. In nearly all cases, the tension between the ideological infusions of the Bronze Age model and the pretension to root historical phasing in material, objective phenomena is noted. In my paper, I focus on the latent definitions of Eurasia that lie within the Bronze Age idea, but have been carefully elided by world and global historians during the past 70 years in a manner that appears to impede our thinking about and our teaching about global history. Now, Jerry Bentley, in his well-known AHR Forum article of 1996, it was called Cross-Cultural Interaction and Periodization in World History. Bentley proposed an alternate periodization in which terms like Neolithic, Chalcolithic, Bronze Age, and Iron Age would be obviated by phrases intended to describe the large-scale social changes of these eras. Nevertheless, the chronology preserved much of the entrenched assumptions about Bronze Age changes, particularly relating to urbanization, migration, and hierarchy. And this was supposed to be a global chronology. When Christian Jorgensen Thompson proposed the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age phrasing, it was unspoken and apparently unproblematic that the archaeology from which it was drawn was almost exclusively Eurasian. For Thompson and many of his contemporaries, anything that encompassed Europe and Egypt and India and China was by its nature comparative, and its reach would be global. So the fact that copper and bronze technology was not known in sub-Saharan Africa and Australia or the Americas, that only meant in his model that history had not got to those regions yet. When I say history not getting there, it's literal, because the origins of written history in Eurasia came to be regarded as a patent phenomenon of the Bronze Age. It was assumed that metallurgy was a necessary stage in human development, and its permeation of Egypt, India, China, and Europe was an emblem of the progressiveness of these civilizations. Others presumably would have arrived there at their slower rates of progression if they had not instead got pushed into these technological ages as a result of their subjugation by Europeans in particular. Such implications were rooted in stadialism that was around a long time before Marx, but Marx's paradigm had reinforced it and refined it. So in much the same way that Marx insisted that feudal patterns must precede and give rise to capitalism, Thompson had postulated that Bronze Age technologies must precede and give rise to Iron Age technologies. Thus, Bronze Age societies were the foundation for the rise of human societies in which the technological development would continue and would lead to their leadership, indeed their hegemony over others. These societies were all in Eurasia. No other continent had a Bronze Age, and therefore no other continent had a path of its own toward modernity. Now, few historians today would agree with such a premise, but the persistence of an implicit definition of Eurasia by the patent ideations of the Bronze Age continue to induce historians to believe that comparative and broad view histories encompassing Europe and some other venue, frequently India or China, are not Eurocentric, but are indeed world or global in spirit. But comparative studies intended to decenter Europe are by definition Eurocentric, and studies that retain the stadial assumptions of Bronze Age generation of the Iron Age simply extend old Eurocentric assumptions to the rest of Eurasia, which is then taken as global. Even in its original formulation, the Bronze Age idea featured bronze itself as an index phenomenon. That is, the production and the dissemination of bronze metallurgy was understood to be derived from and reflect the productive interaction of other phenomena, particularly intensive agriculture and animal domestication, the development of roads and transportation technologies, the emergence of ceramics industries using higher and higher temperatures, and the development of societies, particularly governments, in which a demand for bronze items was sustained. Now, as shown here, the areas of Eurasia, including North Africa, affected by, I would say defined by, Bronze Age, had at its center the development and dissemination of the Indo-European languages. This map is actually outdated. It doesn't show them originating in Anatolia. It has them originating in the old place, sort of near the Urals. But anyway, you can see it's showing them disseminating. And it also shows the areas that are now associated with the Botai, Yamnaya, and Sintashta cultures that are assumed to be the material manifestations of Indo-European settlement. Technically speaking, areas where tin was being extracted from the second millennium BCE to the first century of the Common Era might be better associated with the Bronze Age, since bronze was dependent not only upon copper, which was often difficult to acquire, but most especially tin, which was even more difficult to acquire. But tin working in this era was not exclusive to Eurasia, nor was metallurgy dependent upon tin and copper. And we should note here that the issue is not metal, but heat-dependent metallurgy. North Americans in the period of the Bronze Age were familiar with copper and many other metals, and mining operations were common. But the metals were hammered to soften and shape them. Thus, North America did not have a Bronze Age, and as Thompson's idea predicted, it did not have an Iron Age. But Mesoamerica and South America did have metallurgy, particularly the alloy of copper and gold. This appears to have been the type that the Europeans called tumbaga or tumbaga, various other variants. Looks like it was originally a Tagalog word, picked up by the Spanish in Indonesia, where it described a kind of brass that was common in Southeast Asia. In the New World, the Spanish encountered it in the Caribbean, in Mexico, in South American highlands, and trade items made of this had been disseminated through the Mississippi Basin sort of commercial network through North America. But the Caribbean and Mesoamerica and South America were not Bronze Age, even though they had metallurgy whose temperatures might have rivaled those of Eurasia. One reason might have been tin, which at the time was even more difficult to attain in the Americas than it was in the Mediterranean. But Mesoamerica had tin sources, and there is evidence it was used with copper, but it was not common, as it was across Eurasia, to produce weapons in bronze. This might have been what excluded Mesoamerica from the Bronze Age. But what it predicted was that Mesoamerica would never have an Iron Age. And it's impossible to exclude this from the reasoning of 19th and early 20th century histories of European imperialism in the New World. The generalization of this pattern of thinking that European imperialism was a technological advancement for non-European regions, generalization of that pattern of thought to the historiography of Africa, Australia, and the Americas was rooted in the logic of the Bronze Age as the necessary precursor of the Iron Age, and the Iron Age as the necessary precursor of later technological developments of Europe and China and India. And it's not haphazard, it's not a coincidence that the height of Bronze Age ideation coincided with the height of European imperial expansion in the 19th and very early 20th centuries. But the history of sub-Saharan Africa has long been the primary antagonist of Bronze Age to Iron Age logic. Archaeology has consistently shown that indigenous bronze production was indeed absent from sub-Saharan Africa, except as objects that had been imported from Egypt, Nubia, or North Africa. But archaeology equally affirms that iron mining and smelting were common in some regions of Africa, in some cases even before the Bronze Age in Eurasia, and certainly during it. The age of iron mining and smelting in sub-Saharan Africa was not derived from a Bronze Age. More controversially, the earliest iron smelting, chronologically right at the beginning of the Bronze Age, in Eurasia, so far, appears to have been in Egypt. The place most likely to be in contact with iron smelting regions of sub-Saharan Africa. So was iron smelting in Eurasia not a production of the Bronze Age, but the result of an imported technology from Africa? That is not a majority interpretation, but it's also not something that can be excluded with present knowledge. Whatever it means, African prehistory is a clear repudiation not of the Bronze Age as an objectification of combined phenomena, but as a logic of the progress of human technology. The answer, of course, is that while many phenomena of the Bronze Age make sense to lump together as a descriptive complex, and I would say even more than bronze itself, the emergence of writing, the emergence of mass domestication of the horse, the expansion and acceleration of migration, the rise of large trade-oriented cities, the implicit logic of the Bronze Age as a stadial step in the emergence of modern configurations of power does not make sense. Mining and metallurgy are complex phenomena with archaeological chronologies that, as of this point, do not conform to our conventional historiographical concepts of time and space. The Iron Age comes after the Bronze Age in Eurasia, largely because the understanding of oxygen in the development of carbon and charcoal as alloys. Once this was understood, the ubiquity of iron deposits meant that iron production would quickly relegate bronze to ceremonial, decorative, and ancillary technological uses. But these material considerations aside, bronze smelting in itself did not define a Bronze Age, and that's what Bentley laid out in his reperiodization. I'm agreeing with him. And iron smelting did not define an Iron Age. But Bronze Age phenomena did define Eurasia as a community of exchange. And this is what I think is not made explicit enough in global studies. Persisting ideas of the West have permitted us to see much of Asia and the Middle East as part of a non-Western continuum that includes Africa and the Americas and Australia. Because Eurasia is left implicit, we have not made an explicit enough approach to the distinct histories of Africa and the Americas and Australia. And Australia, by the way, appears to have had no metallurgy before its contacts with Indonesia. Well, this is another way in which Eurasian history has been casually permitted to masquerade as global history, and one which could be aided by making Eurasia explicit. We could maybe ameliorate this problem. Though Bronze Age is a mirage when it's applied to the world, its phenomena may be definitive when applied to peri-historical Eurasia. These phenomena do not predict future hegemony, but they do describe a reticulated economic, cultural, technological entity.